So if we were thinking like in medieval astrologers, what is the first thing we would look at when we have to do a forecasting?
Well, the first big difference is if you look at the similarities, there's a lot of similarities. Medieval astrology, and I can't really talk too much about Hellenistic because medieval's my specialty. It's not that different. Has 7 planets rather than 10 and asteroids and things like that. 7 planets, but it still has 12 signs and it has 12 houses. And the keywords for planets are ones that we'd all recognize as modern astrologers. So Saturn's about restriction, Jupiter's about expansion and generosity and that sort of thing. So in that sense, it seems fairly similar. But what I think the big difference is in modern astrology, we tend to work a lot with signs and we kind of give keywords to signs. So if you see a chart where there's a whole bunch of planets in Aquarius, you'll say, ah, right, okay, a lot of Aquarius stuff going on here. This person's probably independent. They might be a little bit revolutionary or a little bit quirky because that's what Aquarius is about. In medieval astrology, it's the planets that are the actors. Signs are just places where they hang out. So the planets themselves are the actors on your stage of the chart. So Saturn is a bit cold and drab and miserable and restricting. He's like your strict father that won't let you eat chocolate, whereas Jupiter's like your uncle who gives you too much chocolate at Easter and you end up being sick and you realize you probably need a balance between the two. So it's all about the planets. And so the first thing a medieval astrologer does isn't to say, oh, look, there's a load of planets in Aquarius. They'd say, some of these planets are really working hard for you. They're your leading characters. Like Jupiter in Sagittarius is strong because he's in rulership, whereas the sun in Aquarius isn't as strong because the sun would really like to be in Leo. And being on the other side, the sun's in detriment. That doesn't mean the sun's terrible. It just means that Jupiter's probably going to be more prominent in your life than your sun. And so you look at those keywords, and then you say, so what areas of life does Jupiter rule? What areas of life does the sun rule? So you start off by looking at planetary strength and saying, who are the strong actors here? You're watching a play. Who are the lead players? Who are the great actors in this? So that's
Ah,
the first big difference.
yeah. But if somebody has, let's say, Saturn as the big actor, would
Mhm.
you say it's going to be a harder life than if it's Jupiter?
I don't think so. My only strong planet is Saturn. It's the only one in rulership. Everything else is peregrine, which means it has absolutely no dignity at all. So, um, I think I probably work hard, but I enjoy it. I just like, I don't like
Mm.
being bored. I like doing things. So I don't feel as though I'm working hard. So everyone says, "Oh, you're working hard all the time," but I love it. That's what I would do even if I wasn't being paid for it. So, um, everything I've done, I've really enjoyed. And my first Saturn return was fabulous. Most people find a Saturn returns terrible, but my first Saturn return, um, I had a mortgage at the time that I'd had for 3 years. I was really having to watch the pennies because it was eating up all my money. But then when I had my Saturn return, I got promoted, got a much earned a lot more money, ended up going on holiday 5 times, and the mortgage wasn't the millstone around my neck. So that's not what you would expect from a Saturn return, but that was my Saturn return. And I think that Saturn probably says when you're 29, right, have you got yourself sorted yet? Are you still messing about and being like a child? Or have you actually got your act together and done the sort of things that I, conservative Saturn, want you to do? And in my case, I did have a fairly conventional job, did all the right things. So Saturn approved of that. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best path, but it was the path that Saturn liked. So I was kind of rewarded. On my second Saturn return, I got my PhD. So Saturn returns have been very nice to me. Jupiter is also in Capricorn in my chart, and it's in fall there. And my Jupiter returns haven't been quite as nice, apart from the last one, because that was also a Saturn return.
Mm. So would you look when you do the transits? Is it just for the returns that you look at the condition of the planet natally, or for any kind of transit?
Yeah, I do use transits, and this is an interesting point because uh, that's the go-to method of prediction in modern forecasting, in modern astrology, certainly in natal work, well, and for mundane work and seeing what's going to be going on. They weren't really used very much in medieval astrology. They had a different set of
Ah.
forecasting tools, and transits didn't really play a major part in them. But I do use transits, and yes, it's like if I've got a Saturn transit, I'm going to see what, Saturn's good for me. I like my Saturn. So when Saturn crosses my ascendant, it tends to be quite a good time rather than a restricting time because Saturn is rewarding if you've followed Saturn's rules. And when you don't, then Saturn can be quite challenging. When you do, Saturn can be quite nice. But similarly, Jupiter going over things tends to make things bigger, and that's not always good if if you don't get on, if you don't have a good relationship with your Jupiter.
Well, this is very interesting because I think in modern astrology, we look more at the planet, like we give a quality to the planet. And okay, we will change perhaps how the planet is behaving based on the sign. But I don't think when we look at transits, we look so much at the condition of the planet.
No, absolutely. It's just a different focus, even though the ingredients are the same, but they're built slightly differently. And of course, for forecasting, we have to bear in mind that there's two sorts of forecasting. There's personal prediction when you're looking at a natal chart and doing things, and there's mundane astrology. So obviously with things like Pluto coming into Aquarius, that's not something that is you in your natal chart. This is talking about generational things and world conditions and so on. And the medievals had a different, and the Arabs and the Persians had a different mechanism for doing that kind of were replaced by the outer planets, I would say. So they used to use Jupiter-Saturn cycles, which have quite an interesting pattern to them. And that was what they used for huge lengths of time, 240 years, 960 years, and that sort of thing. These days we can use Pluto because that's 270-year cycle, something like that.
Something like that, yes. Yeah. So, sorry, I wanted to ask you before and I forgot. When you talk about medieval astrology, can we frame it in a period?
Yes. It came from these days, it all tends to be called traditional astrology, which I actually find a really confusing term because people think traditional just means standard. I'm on a traditional astrology group and people come along and talk about Pluto aspects. People say, this is a traditional astrology group and we're not supposed to talk about that. And it's like, well, I am a traditional astrologer. I've been doing astrology for 40 years. And it's like, yeah, but that's not what traditional astrology means. When I started doing medieval astrology with Bernadette Brady, it was called medieval astrology, and everybody knows what that means because it does what it says on the tin. So traditional astrology incorporates Hellenistic astrology, which was kind of developed about 2,000 years ago. And that kind of grew into, it was practiced in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire happily adopted this Greek astrology, no problem at all. The Roman Empire, everyone thinks that, it was just Romans speaking Latin. In fact, Roman scholars were bilingual. They had to speak Latin and Greek, and even Roman soldiers could take their vows in Greek rather than Latin. So Greek and Latin were the two languages. Roman emperors wrote their, Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations in Greek. So it was very much a bilingual empire. But then when it became Christian, they were a bit suspicious of astrology because they thought it was a bit pagan. So it was kind of suppressed, and a lot of scholars moved east to Persia because the Persian religion was quite happy to embrace astrology. And then they got taken over by the Islamic Empire about a century later. And for 100 years or so, the Muslim invaders weren't particularly interested in astrology. But about 100 years later, they were, and they started translating all of these mostly Greek texts into Arabic, and there were Persian texts as well. So it was a bit of a melting pot. This Hellenistic astrology had Persian bits added to it, some Indian bits added to it, and some Arabic bits added to it, and that became Arabic astrology. And then that came into Europe in the 12th century, and to all intents and purposes, European medieval astrology was Arabic astrology. And then a few other things got added on. So by the time of William Lilly, you've got a few extra little bits and pieces. But by and large, they're all fairly similar: Hellenistic, Arabic, medieval, Renaissance. And the big change to modern astrology is really a shift to focus rather than a shift to technique, because you still use rulerships in modern astrology. Some techniques have been lost. There have been new ones that have been added. So it's just a slightly different set of tools, but it's not a dramatic break. It is all one long thread in a way.